What happens when millions of secret files are suddenly open to the world and instead of clarity, they reveal chaos, controversy, and questions no one can easily answer? In early February 2026, headlines were dominated by the release of the so-called Epstein Files, a massive declassification order done to the Epstein Files Transparency Act passed in late 2025. On January 30, 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice published approximately 3.5 million pages of investigation records connected to Jeffrey Epstein. Officials described it as the most comprehensive disclosure to date, yet almost immediately the focus shifted from the content to the way the release was handled. Originally, investigators identified around 6 million potentially responsive documents, but only 3.5 million were made public. The remaining 2.5 million pages were withheld, with the DOJ stating they included duplicative material, legally privileged content, or material that could further harm victims. This decision sparked criticism from several lawmakers who argued that full transparency had not been achieved. Another major controversy erupted over redaction failures. Within days, journalists and victims' lawyers reported that technical errors exposed sensitive information, including victims' names, home addresses, and private images, as well as Epstein's financial details. Some documents appeared inconsistently edited, redacted in one version but visible in another, forcing the DOJ to temporarily remove parts of the database to correct the mistakes. The files also contained thousands of references to high-profile individuals across politics, business, and entertainment. Investigators emphasize that appearing in emails, logs, or communications does not itself prove criminal wrongdoing. Among the most discussed mentions were Prince Andrew, with newly surfaced emails and photographs, Peter Mandelson, whose communications and alleged financial links triggered political debate in the UK, Elon Musk, whose emails discussed possible island plans despite his public denial of visiting Bill Gates, referenced in meetings he has said were philanthropic, and other figures including Deepak Chopra, Christopher Poole, Catherine Ruimler, and Donald Trump appearing in various records or logs. Another notable detail involved documents suggesting that, shortly before his death in 2019, Epstein's lawyers were discussing a potential resolution with federal prosecutors. While no agreement was finalized, the records revived questions about what information might never be fully known. Rhetorical question: if the goal of transparency was to finally bring closure, why did the release itself create new debates about privacy, accountability, and the millions of pages still hidden from public view? As of February 4, 2026, the DOJ continued correcting redaction errors while facing legal threats from victims' advocates and mounting political pressure to explain the missing files. Rather than ending the Epstein story, the release reshaped it, shifting attention from secrecy alone to how institutions manage truth, power, and responsibility. In the final days of January 2026, the United States Department of Justice quietly released what would become one of the most controversial document dumps in modern American history. On Friday, January 30, 2026, the DOJ published approximately 3.5 million pages of records related to the long-running investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. The release was mandated by the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a law passed by Congress in late 2025 in response to years of public pressure, lawsuits, and accusations of institutional cover-ups. Officials described it as the most comprehensive declassification ever conducted in the Epstein case. Within days, however, it became clear that the true story was not just what was released but how badly it was handled. The scale of the release and what was missing. According to DOJ disclosures, investigators initially identified roughly 6 million documents as potentially responsive to the law. After an internal review process, only 3.5 million pages were approved for public release. The remaining 2.5 million pages were withheld. The DOJ stated these files contained duplicative material, commercial pornography, legally privileged internal communications content deemed too harmful or traumatizing for victims. This explanation immediately triggered backlash. Lawmakers such as Rep. Ro Khanna and Rep. Thomas Massie accused the DOJ of violating the spirit and possibly the letter A of the Transparency Act by failing to release the full dataset or provide a detailed justification report. To critics, the question was simple: if transparency was the goal, why were millions of pages still hidden? The redaction disaster, any focus on the contents of the files, was quickly overshadowed by a catastrophic failure in privacy protection. Within 48 hours of publication, journalists and victims' attorneys discovered that thousands of files were improperly redacted due to what the DOJ later described as technical and human errors. The exposed information reportedly included victims' full names and home addresses, unredacted nude photographs of abuse survivors, repeated mentions of minor victims' identities, Jeffrey Epstein's full credit card numbers and security codes. In some cases, the same document appeared twice in the database, say one version redacted, the other completely unredacted. Facing immediate outrage, the DOJ temporarily removed large portions of the database to correct the errors. Victims' advocates called the release a secondary violation, arguing that the government had re-traumatized survivors in the name of transparency. By early February, preparations for class action lawsuits against the federal government were already underway. High-profile names mentions, not verdicts. The files contained thousands of references to prominent figures across politics, finance, technology, and entertainment. DOJ officials emphasized that a name appearing in the files does not constitute evidence of criminal wrongdoing, a distinction often lost in public discourse. Still, several figures became focal points due to newly surfaced primary source materials such as emails, photographs, and internal memos. Prince Andrew, Mountbatten Windsor. The release included previously undisclosed emails, undated photographs, including one showing the former Duke of York on all fours over an unidentified woman, messages from 2010 in which Prince Andrew reportedly asked Epstein about meeting a beautiful Russian woman. The materials suggested a level of familiarity extending beyond timelines Prince Andrew had publicly acknowledged. Peter Mandelson in the UK. The files triggered a political storm. Documents referenced an alleged £50,000 financial payment, communications described as unusually warm, suggestions that market-sensitive UK government information may have been shared with Epstein while no court findings were included. The implications led to renewed calls for investigation in Britain. Other notable mentions: Elon Musk. Emails discussing potential visits to Epstein's island. Musk has consistently denied ever attending. Bill Gates. References to meetings, which Gates has previously stated were related to philanthropy. Donald Trump appears in logs and contact records, without new allegations in the 2026 release. Deepak Chopra. Voice messages and emails involving financial advice discussions. Christopher Poole. Notes referencing a meeting with the founder of 4chan. Catherine Ruimler, former White House counsel, listed in scheduling and travel logs. Investigators reiterated that context matters and that many references reflect contact, not conduct. Epstein's final days. Among the most striking revelations were records showing that just days before his death in August 2019, Epstein's legal team was engaged in discussions with federal prosecutors about a possible resolution to his case. The documents suggest that cooperation was being discussed. A negotiated outcome had not been finalized. Epstein died before any agreement could materialize. For many observers, this reignited long-standing questions about accountability and whether critical information died with him. Where things stand, early February 2026. As of February 4, 2026, the DOJ is still correcting redaction errors. Millions of pages remain unreleased. Victims' groups are pursuing legal action. Lawmakers are demanding oversight hearings. What was intended as a final act of transparency has instead exposed systemic failures, legal, technical, and moral. The larger reality: the Epstein files did not deliver a single explosive revelation that neatly closed the case. Instead, they painted a far more disturbing picture, one of institutional protection, uneven accountability, and a justice system that failed both victims and the public. The story of Epstein, it seems, is not finished, not because of what is still hidden, but because of what has now been revealed.